Ever find yourself, scrolling through social media late at night and thinking, ugh, this can't be good for my brain?
It's a thought I think many of us have had, but what's so interesting is that it seems our brains, they actually keep track of those late night scrolls, those early morning runs, everything we do, much longer than we might realize.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, how those everyday routines, the little choices we make each day, are quietly shaping our brains over time.
We're looking at a fascinating new study out of Aalto University and the University of Oulu. They tracked one person's brain activity for 5 months.
5 months, that's incredible.
Right. They were looking at everything, sleep patterns, exercise, even their mood. And what they found really challenges, I think, our understanding of how the brain operates, how it changes over time.
Okay, so let's break it down. What were some of the most surprising things they found?
So one of the biggest surprises, I would say, was this sort of lag effect that they observed.
Lag effect.
Yeah, it turns out that the impact of our daily habits, whether they're good or bad, can actually linger in our brain activity for more than 2 weeks.
2 weeks? That's way longer than I would have thought.
It's longer than most people would guess, yeah.
So wait, you're saying that stressful meeting on Monday, the one that left you feeling frazzled, your brain could still be feeling the effects of it by, Friday the next week?
That's right. It kind of throws a wrench into that whole idea that our brains just react to things in the moment and then move on.
Yeah.
This lag suggests that those tougher days, a bad night's sleep, they might actually have a much more, gradual cumulative effect on our brains than we initially thought.
Wow. So if we're thinking about it like that, those positive things we do, fitting in a workout or, taking time to meditate, those have a long-lasting benefit too.
Exactly. It goes both ways. Just as those not-so-great choices can have that sort of lingering effect, so can those positive routines. It really seems like our brains are in this constant state of adapting, constantly rewiring themselves based on what we do day to day over a long period.
It's like our brains are always taking notes on our habits, even if you don't realize it.
Exactly. And this study really gets into the specifics of what's happening in different parts of the brain, like the default mode network.
Okay, the default mode network. For those of us who, haven't spent a lot of time in a neurobiology lab, what is that exactly?
So, put simply, it's this network of different areas in the brain that's most active when we're at rest. So when we're, daydreaming, reflecting on ourselves, or just letting our minds wander, that's when it's really going.
So it's active when we're in that relaxed, kind of inward-focused state.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is this study found that things like not getting enough sleep, it can actually negatively impact how well the different parts of this network, how well they communicate with each other.
And by connectivity, you mean?
Good question. Yeah, so it's all about how well these different regions within the network are talking to each other.
Yeah.
Think of your brain as like a network of roads and highways. Strong connectivity, that means those roads are clear, information is flowing easily.
Right.
But when that connectivity is disrupted, it's like you hit a roadblock, that communication breaks down.
Which I imagine makes it harder for our brains to do all those important things you were talking about, forming memories, understanding each other's perspectives.
Exactly. And what surprised the researchers was that this kind of disruption in how things are connected, it wasn't just limited to the default mode network. They also saw it happening in the somatomotor network, too.
The somatomotor network, it rings a bell. Remind me what that one is again.
Sure. So that's the part of our brain that controls our movements and processes all of our physical senses. Like when you reach for your coffee cup, the somatomotor network is what lets you coordinate your arm to grab it and what lets you actually feel the cup in your hand.
Wow. So even the parts of our brain that we don't really connect to things like sleep or stress, they can still be affected by those everyday experiences.
Exactly. It really just highlights how deeply interconnected everything in the brain really is. It's not just one isolated area that's being affected by these things. It's like this domino effect. Mm-hmm. One thing impacts another, which impacts another.
It really makes you think twice about staying up late to watch just one more episode or hitting that snooze button instead of going for a run. Speaking of, one of the things in this research that really stood out to me was this link between heart rate variability, that HRV we hear about, and brain connectivity. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So heart rate variability, it's basically how much the time between our heartbeats varies. Mm-hmm. And you might think, a nice steady heartbeat, that's a good thing, right? But actually, a little variation is good. A higher HRV, which we see a lot with things like stress reduction techniques or regular exercise, that actually means our body is more adaptable. It can regulate itself better.
So if I'm following you correctly, A higher HRV could mean that there's better communication happening between all those different parts of our brains, even when we're just relaxing.
That's what this new research seems to suggest. Even when we are relaxing, our brains, they're still picking up on these cues from what our body is doing. It's a good reminder that taking care of our physical health, through exercise, managing stress, getting that sleep, it directly impacts the way that our brains function.
It's wild to think that just like how much our heart rate changes from beat to beat can tell us about how healthy our brains are.
Right. It really shows how connected our minds and our bodies are. And speaking of connections, this study also found some really interesting stuff about how physical activity, it actually changes the way our brains are wired.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We all know that exercise is good for us, good for our brains, but this study actually shows us how.
Exactly. So they found that being physically active, it has this positive impact on something called functional connectivity in the brain. Basically, it helps different parts of our brain communicate and work together better.
So it's almost like exercise is literally strengthening those pathways in our brains, those information highways we were talking about before.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this whole idea of interconnectedness, it's super important for a lot of our brain functions, especially memory and it's called cognitive flexibility.
Oh, cognitive flexibility. I've heard that term. Can you explain what that is?
Of course. So when we talk about cognitive flexibility, we're basically talking about our ability to switch between different tasks or different ways of thinking easily, to be able to adapt to new information and to see things from different points of view. It's that mental agility that helps us to be better problem solvers, more creative thinkers.
Okay, so that feeling you get after a good workout, where you just feel more awake, more focused, that's not just like a mood boost. That's your brain actually getting more agile, more adaptable.
Exactly. This research really highlights just how important movement is, and not just for, our physical health, but for how well our brains work too. It makes you think, how much more clearly could we be thinking? How much more creative could we be if we just moved a little bit more every day?
It's a great question. And speaking of how we keep track of how active we are and all these fascinating measurements, this study wouldn't even be possible without wearable technology, right?
Absolutely. Those fitness trackers, sleep trackers, even those mood tracking apps, all of those things gave the researchers this really amazing, detailed picture of how, what the person was doing each day was affecting their brain over time, especially when they combined it with brain scans.
It's like this participant was living in the future of personalized healthcare. It's kind of thingy, actually. I read that the lead researcher, he was also the subject of the study. But seriously, what does this tell us about the future of brain research? Where do we go from here?
I think this really highlights a really exciting change that's happening toward more naturalistic research. So traditionally, brain studies have always been stuck in the lab, right? You put someone in an fMRI machine, have them do some random task, and you see what their brain does in that moment. But this study and others using wearables, it lets us see the brain in action in a way that's much more like how people actually live.
Which has to give us way more interesting information about how our brains actually work out in the real world, not just in a lab somewhere. The possibilities are pretty amazing.
They are. And it goes way beyond just understanding the brain, too. Think about personalized medicine, especially for things like mental health.
Right. It's like we have this window into how someone's brain is doing in real time. Do you think this tech could help us see early signs of, I don't know, cognitive decline or even Alzheimer's?
That's definitely something researchers are hoping for. So by looking at someone's brainwave patterns and what they do every day, we might be able to pick up on these tiny changes that could mean someone's at risk for, certain brain conditions.
Yeah.
That means we could start treating it sooner, which hopefully means better outcomes.
Wow. That's incredible. And to think this all started because we wanted to know how what we do every day impacts our brains. Speaking of, there was one more really cool finding from this study. Those two waves of brain response. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so they noticed these two distinct patterns in how the brain seemed to be reacting to what was going on each day. They called them the short-term wave and the long-term wave. That short-term wave, it lasts for less than a week, and it seemed to be the brain, kind of immediately adapting to things like a night of bad sleep or a really stressful day. Like you might experience that brain fog, that difficulty concentrating, or just feeling totally drained. But the thing is, those effects, they don't last very long.
So that feeling when you finally get a good night's sleep, your brain is kind of much better. But that long-term wave, that's where things get even more interesting.
Exactly. That long-term wave, that one sticks around for up to 15 days. And what it suggests is that certain things, both good and bad, have this, slower but longer lasting impact on how our brains are structured, how they work. It's like our brains are slowly remodeling themselves based on what we expose them to over and over again.
So it's not just how we feel in the moment, it's how all those repeated experiences end up shaping our brains down the line.
Exactly. And these longer term effects, they were really noticeable in the areas of the brain that deal with attention and memory, which again really makes you realize that those little everyday choices we make, those habits, they can really build up over time and have big impact on how healthy our brains are.
It's kind of like our brains, they're playing the long game, right? Slowly changing and rewiring themselves based on what we do each day.
Yeah, it really makes you think. Even something as simple as, going to bed and waking up around the same time each day or making time for a walk, it could actually be changing the physical structure of our brains.
It's almost like our minds and bodies are working together to sculpt our brains over time.
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth between what we do, what happens to us, and what's going on in our brains.
So if we had to sum up all this incredible research, what would you say is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's that our brains are way more adaptable than we think. And what we do every day, all those little choices, they matter. They have a real impact on, how healthy our brains are, how well they work, both now and in the future.
It's kind of empowering when you think about it that way. Like, we're not just stuck with the brain we were born with.
Exactly. It's never too late to try something new or start a good habit, something that's good for our brains.
I love that. So it's not about stressing over every little thing. It's more about those patterns, those things we do consistently that really make the difference.
Right. It's about being aware of the choices we're making and knowing that those choices, they're shaping our brains in ways we're just starting to understand.
It's a good reminder to really make those brain healthy habits a priority. Getting enough sleep, managing stress, staying active, making time for friends and fam, all of that adds up to a healthier brain. So as we wrap things up, I'm curious. Knowing what we know now about how much our daily routines impact our brains, is there one small change that you're planning to make in your own life?
Well, I've been thinking about adding in a little meditation each day. I've always found that even just taking a few minutes to just, be quiet and focus on my breath, it helps me feel calmer, less stressed. And now, knowing it could be good for my brain in the long run, I'm even more motivated to actually do it every day. How about you? What about you?
I'm totally with you on that. I think for me, it's being better about my sleep schedule. I'm definitely a night owl, but hearing about how much that sleep debt can really affect our brains, it's given me something to think about.
It's all about those little steps, right?
It really is. And for our listeners out there, maybe it's finally going for that daily walk or eating more brain-boosting foods or maybe even signing up for that yoga class. Whatever it is, your brain will be happy you did.
I love that. Taking care of our brains, it's a journey.
Well said. That's a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating look at how those everyday routines shape our amazing brains. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the wonders of science.